In tonight's episode, we are venturing deep into the shadows of Asia, unearthing two stories that will forever change the way you look at the objects and places you thought were safe. Two tales, pulled straight from folklore and whispered warnings, each carrying a darkness that refuses to stay hidden. And the first takes us into the heart of Thailand, where beauty and danger often share the same face. Picture this, the endless rows of market stalls in Bangkok, lanterns glowing, trinkets glittering under the hot buzz of neon, and shopkeepers calling out with smiles that promise bargains and treasures. Among them sits a wooden mask, hand-carved, polished smooth, its painted expression caught between joy and menace. Tourists stop, tempted by its strange charm. By the way, it almost feels alive when the light hits it. The sellers offer the same words every time. Do not take this home. But who really listens? The mask isn't just decoration. It isn't just wood and paint. Legends claim it was carved as a vessel, something designed to hold the spirit of the dead, never to be displayed in a foreign living room. And for those who ignore the warning, for those who carry it across oceans, the nightmare begins the moment it touches their wall. The mask doesn't just watch them, it waits. Under the thick heat of Thailand's capital, the markets are alive with chaos and color. The kind of place where the air smells of grilled meat and incense, where tuk-tuks rattle down narrow streets and vendors shout over one another in a chorus of bargains. For one traveler, a young man named Daniel, this was supposed to be nothing more than an afternoon adventure before his flight home. He had spent 2 weeks wandering temples and beaches, and now he wanted something simple, something physical, to bring back as proof of his journey. A souvenir, something his friends back home could point to and say, "You really went there." The stall that caught his attention was tucked at the very end of the market, half hidden behind larger vendors selling cheap shirts and plastic trinkets. Unlike the others, this one was quiet. The table was lined not with clutter, but with carved wooden masks, some with wide grins, others twisted in anguish, each painted with deep reds and blacks that seemed to shimmer under the weak light bulb hanging overhead. They looked old, as though they belonged in a temple rather than in a marketplace. Daniel paused, drawn to one in particular. The mask's eyes were narrow, the lips frozen in a smile that didn't quite feel human. It was beautiful in a way, but unsettling, too. The wood had been polished so smooth it reflected his face back at him, distorted just enough to feel wrong. He reached for it, running his hand across the cold surface. The shopkeeper's voice broke through the air like a knife. Not that one. Her words were sharp, her face set in a seriousness that contrasted with the friendly haggling he had grown used to. She shook her head slowly, almost pleading. "This mask, no, brings spirits." Daniel laughed nervously, brushing off her concern. To him, it sounded like part of the sales pitch, some attempt to add mystery and intrigue, a story that would make the item more exotic to a foreigner. He asked the price anyway, the woman's lips pressed into a tight line. She repeated herself, softer this time, almost whispering, "Not for you, not to take away, only to keep here." Her hand hovered over the mask as if she wanted to snatch it back, but didn't dare touch it herself. The air felt heavier around that stall, as though the noise of the market had dulled, the shouts and laughter muffled to a distant hum. Daniel hesitated, sensing her unease, but curiosity gnawed at him. He had bought plenty of souvenirs already, t-shirts, a bronze Buddha, even a cheap painting, but none of them carried this kind of story, a cursed mask. The thought made his skin prickle with excitement. What better thing to bring home, he thought, than a piece of folklore. Finally, after a moment of silence, the woman sighed. She wrapped the mask in newspaper with hands that trembled, sliding it into a thin plastic bag. She muttered something under her breath as she worked. Words Daniel couldn't understand, though they sounded like a prayer. When she handed it over, she wouldn't meet his eyes. Daniel left the stall, feeling an odd mix of triumph and unease. The bag seemed heavier than it should be, the mask inside shifting as though it wanted out. He told himself it was just the atmosphere, the way the vendor had acted, that gave it weight. After all, it was only wood, only paint, nothing more. Yet, as he walked back through the crowded alleys toward his hotel, he couldn't shake the feeling that the eyes carved into that mask were following him. Not just watching, but waiting. And in the pit of his stomach, though he refused to admit it, a small voice asked the question he tried to laugh off. What if the warning wasn't just a story? Daniel returned to his hotel just as the evening pressed down over Bangkok, the humid air thick with the promise of rain. He set the plastic bag on the desk by the window, almost relieved to place it out of his hands. For a while, he ignored it. He showered, flipped through the channels on the old television, and ordered room service, convincing himself it was just another trinket. Yet, every so often, his eyes drifted back toward the desk, toward the lump of newspaper wrapping that sat so still, so quiet, as though it were waiting. It was only when he finally unwrapped it that he felt the first shift. The mask seemed darker now than it had in the market, its carved smile sharper, the painted edges almost wet-looking in the dim hotel light. He turned it in his hands, and for a fraction of a second, he thought he felt warmth radiating from the wood. Not the warmth of sun-baked wood, but something alive, pulsing. He dropped it onto the desk, laughing nervously at himself. That night, sleep came strangely easy. For 2 weeks of traveling, Daniel had tossed and turned in unfamiliar beds, waking with the sounds of the city clawing through thin walls. But with the mask sitting across the room, his body sank into the mattress as though pulled down by invisible hands. He drifted into the kind of deep, dream-heavy sleep he hadn't felt in years. Dreams so vivid, they clung to him long after he opened his eyes. At first, the dreams were beautiful. He was standing in a temple, golden light flooding through the windows, monks chanting in low voices that seemed to vibrate through his bones. He felt powerful, centered, as though something had awakened inside him. But just before he woke, the tone shifted. The temple grew colder, the light dimmed, and the chanting turned into whispers. Not one voice, but many, circling him from all directions, too soft to understand, but too close to ignore. He sat up in the dark hotel room, his heart pounding. The air felt wrong, cooler than it should have been, as if someone had opened the window. Yet, the curtains didn't stir, and when he checked, the latch was still locked. The mask stared back at him from the desk, its narrow eyes gleaming in the glow of the city lights, leaking through the glass. The next morning, Daniel brushed it off as jet lag mixed with imagination, but the unease lingered. At breakfast, he caught himself glancing at the bag he had repacked the mask into, half expecting to see it move. When he carried it through the lobby on his way out, the receptionist, a young man with perfect posture and polite eyes, noticed. His gaze lingered a beat too long on the edge of the bag where the carved wood poked through. His polite smile faltered. He looked as though he wanted to say something but swallowed the words instead, bowing quickly before turning away. It was subtle, but Daniel caught it. That tiny shift, that flicker of recognition. He asked himself why a hotel employee, who must see hundreds of tourists with bags every day, would react to his. That evening, things deepened. Daniel returned to his room after another day of wandering the city. He tossed the bag on the desk again, this time leaving it half open. While scrolling through his phone in bed, he noticed the air conditioning seemed to falter. A sudden draft brushed over his skin, colder than the machine could ever produce. The curtains stirred gently even though the window was locked tight. Then came the whisper. Soft, like someone pressing their mouth just over his shoulder. A sound too clear to dismiss as imagination. He whipped around, but the room was empty. Empty except for the mask. sitting where he had left it, its grin frozen wider in the half-dark. Daniel told himself it was just exhaustion, nerves amplified by the vendor's ominous warning. But the question wouldn't leave him. Why had she tried so hard to stop him? Why had she wrapped it like she was afraid to touch it? And why, when he closed his eyes, could he still hear those faint voices, circling him in the silence of his hotel room? The mask hadn't even left Thailand yet, and already something was beginning. The next few days unfolded with a kind of unease Daniel couldn't quite put into words. At first, it was easy enough to dismiss the strange sleep, the vivid dreams, the cold drafts. Traveling alone often played tricks on the mind, he told himself. But then the events began stacking, one on top of the other, too deliberate to ignore. On his third morning with the mask, Daniel took it out of its wrapping and laid it on the desk in plain sight. He wanted to prove to himself that it was nothing, that it was just an object. Yet as soon as he did, he felt the room shift. The air grew heavier, charged, like the moments before a storm. He left it there and went about his day, but when he returned that night, something was different. The mask wasn't where he left it. He had placed it in the center of the desk, propped against the wall, but now it leaned slightly to the left, facing the bed. For a long time, he stood frozen in the doorway, staring at it, trying to convince himself that maybe the cleaning staff had moved it. But when he asked at the front desk the next morning, the maid assigned to his floor shook her head furiously. Her English was broken, but her meaning was clear enough. She hadn't touched it. She wouldn't touch it. That was the second clue. The third came later that night, when he took a tuk-tuk ride back from the city center. The driver, a wiry old man with deep creases carved into his face, noticed the bag on Daniel's lap. It was nothing unusual, just the mask wrapped again in paper and plastic, but the man's reaction was instant. His eyes darted from the road to the bag, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the handlebars tighter. Finally, he said something in Thai, his voice sharp and urgent. Daniel shook his head, not understanding, but the driver repeated the phrase, slower this time, almost spitting the words out. Later, when Daniel translated the phrase on his phone, his stomach dropped. The driver had said, "You carry the dead." From then on, the atmosphere in the hotel grew oppressive. At night, Daniel's dreams grew darker, the whispers louder. The once golden temple of his visions was now a decaying ruin, the monks chanting replaced by low moans echoing from unseen corners. He woke with the sheets tangled around him, drenched in sweat despite the chill in the air. Each morning he swore he would leave the mask behind, abandon it, but each time he reached for the bag, something inside him recoiled, as though the mask itself didn't want to be left. The conflicting character arrived in the form of a fellow traveler named May, a Chinese woman he met in the hotel's cafe. She noticed his tired eyes, the way he jumped at the smallest noises. When he admitted he hadn't been sleeping well, she pressed gently, asking if he had bought anything unusual from the markets. At first, he lied, brushing her off. But when she caught sight of the newspaper bundle under his arm, her expression hardened. "You shouldn't have that," she said flatly. Daniel laughed nervously. "It's just a mask." Her eyes didn't leave his. "It's never just a mask." She refused to explain further, only warning him to get rid of it before he left Thailand. That night, her words burned in his mind as he lay in bed, staring at the desk where the mask sat watching him. Every time he closed his eyes, the whispers grew sharper, clearer, almost forming words. He could swear one of the voices called his name. The following evening, May was gone. No one at the hotel had seen her leave, and her room was empty, as if she had never been there at all. Daniel felt a sick dread creep over him. It was as though she had appeared solely to warn him, and then vanished once she had spoken. By now, the mask wasn't simply an object anymore. It was part of his nights, part of his dreams, part of his very presence. And though every instinct screamed at him to abandon it, another, quieter pull held him close, as if he had already stepped into a role he didn't fully understand. The keeper. The thought whispered itself into his mind, uninvited, and no matter how hard he tried to push it away, it stayed. Daniel's final nights in Bangkok spiraled into a blur of unease, so thick it felt impossible to claw his way back out. Sleep, once heavy and dream-filled, became a battlefield. When he closed his eyes, he was dragged instantly into the ruined temple, where shadows grew taller than the walls and voices whispered from every crack in the floor. He would jolt awake only to find the same voices leaking into his hotel room, circling him in the dark. The mask had moved again. At first, it had only shifted slightly, leaning toward the bed. Now it sat directly on the nightstand beside him, its grin inches from his face. He hadn't put it there. He was certain. His heart slammed against his chest as he sat up, the cold sweat on his skin prickling under the weak glow of the bedside lamp. He thought of May's warning, the tuk-tuk driver's words, the trembling hands of the shopkeeper. They had all known. The breaking point came on a storm-heavy night when the city outside drowned under sheets of rain. The wind howled through the streets, rattling the windows of the hotel. Daniel sat frozen in his bed, too afraid to sleep, the mask perched like a sentry beside him. Around midnight, the lights flickered and died, plunging the room into blackness so complete he couldn't see his own hands. The storm outside wailed, and then, under the roar of the rain, came the sound of chanting. It started faint, as though carried through the walls from some faraway place. A low, rhythmic hum that grew louder, closer, surrounding him from every side. Daniel's body seized with terror as the room filled with a scent of burning incense, thick and suffocating, though nothing burned nearby. The mask's eyes glimmered faintly in the dark. The chanting deepened, and shadows began to take shape around the bed. Faint outlines at first, then clearer. Human figures with hollow faces, their forms made of smoke and ash. They stood in a circle, their heads bowed, hands raised toward the mask. Daniel scrambled back against the headboard, clutching the sheets like a child, his breath ragged in his throat. "What do you want from me?" he whispered, his voice shaking. One of the shadows lifted its head, and in the dim lightning glow that flashed through the curtains, Daniel saw its mouth move. The whisper reached him clearer than before, curling directly into his ear. "Keeper." His blood ran cold. The figures stepped closer, their forms tightening around him, pressing in until the room felt suffocating. The air grew icy, his breath visible in front of him. The mask pulsed with a strange glow, its carved smile widening as if alive, the wood shifting before his eyes. Desperate, Daniel leapt from the bed, grabbing the mask with shaking hands. The moment he touched it, the chanting stopped. Silence crashed over the room so suddenly it was deafening. His chest heaved, his ears rang. But the silence didn't bring relief. It brought awareness. Because now, he felt it. A presence inside the wood. It wasn't just an object. It was filled, alive, in some way that defied everything he understood. The sensation was overwhelming, as though countless eyes turned inward, peering out from the grain of the mask straight into him. A flood of whispers filled his mind, not spoken aloud but pressing directly against his thoughts, too many voices speaking at once. He dropped it onto the floor with a strangled cry, stumbling backward. The mask landed face up, unbroken, still smiling. But something had shifted. For the first time, Daniel felt the weight of it, not just in his hands, but in his chest, like a chain had been hooked into his very soul. The door burst open. Startled, he turned to see the hotel maid from earlier, the one who had refused to touch it. She stood in the doorway, clutching a bundle of incense sticks and a bowl of water. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear, Yet she moved with purpose. Without asking permission, she crossed the room, muttering prayers in Thai, and lit the incense with trembling fingers. Smoke curled in the air, thick and acrid, weaving around the mask like shackles. Daniel backed against the wall, his voice breaking. "What's happening? What is this thing?" She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her hands shook violently as she placed the bowl beside the mask, sprinkling droplets of water over it while whispering faster and faster. The shadows recoiled, slipping back into the corners of the room as if the smoke burned them. For a moment, Daniel thought it might end there, that the ritual might save him. But then the mask shuddered. The wood cracked faintly, its grin stretching further, impossibly wide. The chanting voices surged again, drowning out hers, roaring inside Daniel's head. His knees buckled as his vision blurred, darkness edging his sight. He realized then, with a clarity sharper than fear, that she wasn't just trying to cleanse the mask, she was trying to protect herself from him. Because he wasn't just a man holding a cursed object anymore, he had become part of it. The maid dropped the incense and fled the room, slamming the door behind her. Daniel was left alone with the mask lying on the floor, still smiling, still pulsing with unnatural life. And for the first time, he understood the depth of the trap he had stepped into. He wasn't the owner of the mask. He was its prisoner. The hours after the maid fled, dragged into a haze of fear that Daniel could barely process. He stayed awake, pressed into the corner of the room, watching the mask where it lay on the floor. It hadn't moved since she left, hadn't pulsed again, hadn't cracked. Yet its presence filled the air, thick and heavy, as if the room itself had shifted to make space for it. Every time he tried to close his eyes, the whispers started again, not outside his head this time, but inside, bleeding into his thoughts like ink into water. By morning, exhaustion forced him into a restless half-sleep. He woke to a soft knock at the door. When he opened it, the maid stood there once more, her face pale but determined. In her hands, she carried a string of beads, worn and cracked from age. She pushed them into his chest before he could speak. "You must understand," she said in broken English, her voice urgent. "This mask is not souvenir. It is vessel, spirit, house." Daniel blinked at her, gripping the beads. "A vessel? For what?" Her eyes flicked toward the desk, to the bundle where the mask now sat, as though it had crawled back into its wrapping by itself during the night. She shivered before answering. "For the dead. For those who must not be free." The words landed heavy, reshaping every strange moment he had experienced since the market. The shopkeeper's trembling hands. The tuk-tuk, driver's warning. May's sudden disappearance. Each had tried to tell him in their own way that what he carried wasn't just cursed, it was purposeful. The mask wasn't an accident of superstition, it was designed to hold something. "Why me?" he whispered. "Why is this happening to me?" The maid shook her head slowly. "Not you. Anyone. Whoever takes it becomes keeper. Mask feeds. Always feeds." The phrase chilled him to the core. It reframed everything. The deep, unnatural sleep, the vivid dreams, the way he felt drained each morning, as if something was pulling pieces of him away night after night. The mask wasn't simply haunting him, it was feeding on him. Using him. Her hands trembled as she gestured toward the prayer beads now in his grip. "This may slow it, not stop. You must take to monks, only they know way. But," she hesitated, her gaze darting down the hallway, "not many survive. Too many keepers before you. They do not let go." The words sank into Daniel like lead. He wasn't just fighting against some object. He was part of a cycle, a line of cursed owners stretching back generations. Each one passing the burden, knowingly or not, to the next. And now, it was his turn. When he looked back toward the desk, The mask's grin seemed sharper, its hollow eyes mocking him. He imagined the faceless shadows from his dreams, the chanting voices, all bound inside that piece of wood. If the mask was a vessel, then what lived within it wasn't just one spirit. It was many, countless. The maid backed away, her courage spent. Do not keep it. Do not leave with it. If you go, it follows. It never stays here. And then she was gone again, leaving Daniel alone in the room with the truth unraveling around him. The revelation clawed at his sanity. Everything he had dismissed before, his heavy sleep, the cold drafts, the whispers, they were no longer coincidences. They were symptoms. Signs of the mask drawing closer, sinking deeper into him, tying him to its endless hunger. He understood now why the vendor had begged him not to take it, why she had wrapped it with trembling hands. She hadn't been trying to make a sale. She had been trying to contain it. He thought of May, of her final warning, and the empty room she had left behind. Had she seen this same truth before him? Had the mask reached for her too, pulling her away, erasing her? The beads in his hand felt useless, their weight far too light against the enormity of what he faced. Still, he looped them around his wrist, clinging to the faint hope they might hold back whatever was gnawing at him from the inside. For the first time since buying the mask, Daniel considered leaving Thailand without it, abandoning it in the hotel, on the street, in the river. But the maid's words returned, cruel and unshakable. If you go, it follows. The mask wasn't just an object in his possession. It was bound to him now, tethered like a shadow. He couldn't abandon it, because it would never truly leave him. And as that truth settled into his bones, Daniel realized the mask had already chosen him. Not as an owner, not even as a victim, but as its next keeper in a chain that stretched back centuries. The cursed mask had always found someone, and this time it had found him. Daniel packed his bags before dawn, moving through the room as though every shadow might reach for him. The mask, now swaddled again in newspaper, sat silently on the desk, its weight looming larger than anything else he carried. He tried not to look at it, but even with his back turned, he felt its presence pressing against him like a hand between his shoulders. In the lobby, the receptionist glanced up as Daniel wheeled his suitcase past. For a moment, their eyes met, and the young man's polite smile faltered into something darker, recognition. He bowed quickly, as if to distance himself, and Daniel felt the sting of being seen not as a guest, but as a marked man. The streets outside were slick with last night's rain. Tuk-tuks splashed by, neon signs blinked against the pale morning, and yet the world felt strangely hollow. He hailed a cab to the airport, gripping his bag tight, whispering to himself that once he was on the plane, it would all end. He would be free, but the moment the taxi pulled away, he heard it again. The whisper. Faint at first, curling up from the plastic bag at his side. A chorus of voices, layered and low, threading through the hum of the engine. They weren't angry, they weren't threatening, they were patient. The driver glanced at him through the mirror, his eyes darting to the bag. His jaw tightened, his knuckles whitening on the wheel. He didn't say a word, but Daniel saw the fear anyway. As the city slipped past the windows, Daniel tightened his grip on the beads around his wrist. The maid's warning echoed in his mind like a curse. If you go, it follows. And when he dared to look down, just once, at the bag resting against his leg, he saw the faintest shift in the newspaper wrapping. As if the mask inside was smiling wider, stretching itself, delighted to be carried somewhere new. Daniel looked away quickly, his heart hammering. He had left the hotel. He had left the market. But he hadn't left the mask. The keeper's journey had only just begun. 2 stories, 2 different countries, yet bound by the same chilling thread. In Thailand, a carved mask that feeds on its keeper, turning a simple souvenir into a curse that clings across oceans. And now we turn to Indonesia, where another object, smaller, stranger, but no less dangerous, waits in the shadows, the Jenglot. A doll-like figure no larger than a child's toy, with fangs, claws, and human hair, whispered about in hushed voices across villages and cities alike. Just like the mask, it is no mere decoration. It is a vessel, hungry for blood, binding itself to whoever dares claim it. Where the mask feeds on life itself, the Jenglot demands offerings, and those who fail to obey soon discover that neglect carries a price far darker than superstition. The heat of Jakarta clung to the streets like a second skin, thick with the smell of fried food, exhaust, and rain-soaked concrete. For a man named Adrian, a traveler chasing oddities and stories rather than beaches and cocktails, this city was exactly where he wanted to be. While most tourists filled their days with malls and monuments, Adrian spent his afternoons wandering the narrow back alleys, searching for something stranger, something he could bring home that nobody else would dare to touch. He had heard of the Jenglot before, in passing. Whispers from online forums, photos so grainy they looked like props from old horror movies, rumors of doll-sized creatures kept in jars and offered blood-like sacrifices. He didn't believe in curses, not really, but the idea fascinated him. A real talisman, tied to local superstition, small enough to carry, yet dripping with the kind of mystery that would make for a story worth retelling. His search took him away from the tourist markets and into a quieter part of the city, where the stalls were shaded by torn blue tarps and vendors spoke in hushed voices. Here, the air felt different, heavy, as though even the stray cats moved slower. He noticed how the locals avoided one particular stand near the corner, where the goods were covered not in bright fabric but in dull sheets of glass jars and boxes lined with faded cloth. Behind it sat an older man, his face lined deep with wrinkles, his eyes sharp and watchful. On the table before him lay rows of objects, bones, teeth, preserved animals, but Adrian's gaze locked instantly on the figure in the center. No larger than his hand, the shriveled body looked like something between a human and a corpse. Its skin was leathery, dark, stretched tight over bones too thin to be natural. Long strands of black hair spilled down its back, tangled and greasy, while two sharp fangs protruded from its mouth. Its tiny arms ended in claw-like nails, curled stiff against its chest. And worst of all were its eyes, glassy, unblinking, staring straight at him with a depth that felt alive. Adrian leaned closer, fascinated. "What is it?" he asked. The old man's reply was simple, but heavy with warning. "Jenglot." He didn't smile. He didn't try to bargain. Instead, he lowered his voice. "You do not keep without respect. You must feed. Blood." The words hung in the air between them, carried on the weight of something that felt less like a warning and more like a rule. Adrian chuckled awkwardly, assuming it was part of the sales pitch. Another bit of exotic mystery to make a relic feel dangerous. Still, he couldn't look away. The man's hands trembled slightly as he wrapped the Jenglot in layers of cloth, then placed it inside a wooden box. Unlike the cheerful sellers Adrian had seen elsewhere, this man seemed eager to part with it, pushing the box toward him as though relieved to let it go. Adrian paid quickly, tucking the box under his arm. As he walked away, he told himself it was just a piece of folklore, a strange souvenir for his shelf back home. But even as he melted back into the noise of the city, he couldn't shake the feeling that the glassy eyes of the figure still stared at him from inside its wrappings, watching, waiting. And though he tried to brush it off, he couldn't stop his mind from circling back to the vendor's final words. "You must feed. Blood." Adrian returned to his rented guest house late that night, the rain still dripping from the tiled roofs as thunder rolled in the distance. The streets outside were empty now, but the sounds of Jakarta never fully slept. Dogs barking in alleys, a motorbike echoing somewhere far off, the hum of neon signs flickering against wet pavement. Inside his small room, the air smelled faintly of mildew and dust, the kind of atmosphere that clung to old places. He set the wooden box on the desk near the window, the weight of it oddly disproportionate to its size. At first, he didn't open it. He left it there while he unpacked the rest of his things, convincing himself he wasn't nervous, just tired. Yet his eyes kept drifting back to the box, tracing the uneven lines of its carved lid. Finally, unable to resist, he slid it open. The Jenglot lay curled inside, its shriveled body unmoving, its tangled hair spilling across the fabric like a veil. Even in the dim yellow glow of the bedside lamp, the detail of it unsettled him. The claws, the fangs, the glassy eyes that seemed to catch the light, reflecting it back in a way no doll should. Adrian told himself it was nothing more than craftsmanship, but a strange chill lingered in the air, raising goosebumps across his arms. He set the figure carefully on the desk, whispering to himself that it was harmless. Just wood and bone and cloth. He turned off the lamp and lay in bed, listening to the rain patter against the windows. That was when he heard it. At first it was faint, so faint he thought it was his imagination. The sound of scratching. A slow, deliberate scrape, like nails against wood. Adrian sat up, heart thudding, straining to listen. The sound came again, louder this time. Not from the walls, not from outside, from the desk. He flicked on the lamp. The Jenglot hadn't moved. It sat in the same position he had left it, its claws curled tight, its eyes fixed forward. Yet the wooden box beside it bore 3 fresh marks across its lid. Thin, shallow scratches that hadn't been there before. Adrian's throat went dry. He tried to laugh, telling himself the marks must have been there all along, that he hadn't noticed them in the dim light. He closed the box firmly, slipped the Jenglot back inside, and shoved it to the far corner of the desk. Then he lay back down, pulling the blanket up to his chest, staring at the ceiling until exhaustion forced his eyes shut. When he woke the next morning, sunlight spilling weakly through the curtains, the box had moved. He remembered clearly pushing it into the corner, but now it sat squarely in the middle of the desk, open. The Jenglot stared up at him, exposed, its hair fanned across the wood, as though it had been lifted and dropped. Adrian sat up quickly, his chest tightening. His first thought was that someone had entered his room, but the door was locked, the window bolted shut. There was no sign of disturbance, except for the doll. Later, at breakfast in the common area, Adrian tried to shake the unease. The other guests chatted idly, and the hostess brought him tea with a kind smile. Yet, when she noticed the small wooden box under his arm, her expression shifted. Her eyes lingered on it too long, and the color drained slightly from her face. She said nothing, but when Adrian set the box on the table beside his plate, she made an excuse to leave the room entirely. It was subtle, but it was enough. Another reaction. Another warning. Unspoken, but heavy. By the time Adrian returned to his room, the unease had sharpened into something more tangible. He placed the Jenglot back on the desk, forcing himself to watch it closely this time, as though the simple act of keeping his eyes on it would strip away the illusion. Yet as the hours stretched, he couldn't shake the sense that the figure was no longer just an object. It was waiting. And though he still tried to laugh at himself, deep down Adrian knew the truth. He refused to speak aloud. The scratches, the movement, the way people looked at it. The Jenglot wasn't content to be kept. It wanted something. The days that followed wrapped Adrian's stay in a tension he couldn't escape. The scratching never stopped. At first, it came only at night, faint and steady from the desk. But soon he began hearing it in daylight too, while reading or sipping tea by the window, always the same deliberate scrape, like claws dragging across wood. He would glance over, and the Jenglot would be still, its tiny arms rigid, its glassy eyes unblinking, yet the marks on the box multiplied, thin white streaks etched deeper each morning, as though the figure was trying to claw its way out. The second event came late one evening when Adrian noticed something far more disturbing. He had left the Jenglot sitting on the desk before going out for dinner. When he returned hours later, the room felt colder than the humid air outside should allow. The box was open again, but this time the figure's hair was longer. Tangled strands trailed across the desk like cobwebs, spilling down over the side toward the floor. Adrian froze in the doorway, his mind scrambling for an explanation. Perhaps he hadn't noticed before. Perhaps the dampness in the air had warped it somehow. Yet when he leaned closer, he swore the hair smelled faintly metallic, as though soaked in iron. That night, his dreams soured. He woke drenched in sweat, the taste of copper on his tongue, his pillow streaked with tiny crimson dots he couldn't explain. By morning, Adrian's nerves were frayed. He carried the wooden box with him downstairs to breakfast, unwilling to leave it alone in his room. The hostess was there again, her warm smile faltering the moment she spotted what he carried. This time, she didn't hide her unease. She approached slowly, her gaze fixed on the box as though it were dangerous. "You keep this thing?" she asked, her accent heavy but her meaning sharp. Adrian managed a nervous chuckle. "It's just a talisman, a curiosity." Her face hardened, lips pressing into a thin line. "Not curiosity, spirit trap. You must feed." She hesitated, then whispered, "If no blood, it takes from you." The words chilled him. He wanted to dismiss them as superstition. Yet, her trembling hands and lowered voice carried a sincerity he couldn't ignore. When he pressed for more, she shook her head quickly and left, muttering prayers under her breath as she disappeared into the kitchen. That warning lingered in Adrian's mind all day. Feed it. Blood. The vendor had said the same thing in the market, but he had laughed it off as part of the sales pitch. Now, with two different locals warning him in the same hushed tone, it didn't feel like coincidence. The conflicting character came the next evening in the form of another guest, a man named Rizal who claimed to be from a nearby village. He noticed Adrian staring at the Jenglot in the common area, the box open just enough to reveal the shriveled figure inside. Rizal pulled up a chair without asking, his expression grim. "You should not have this," he said bluntly. Adrian bristled. "Why does everyone keep saying that?" "Because it doesn't belong to you," Rizal answered. "Jenglot are kept only by those who know the rituals. You are a foreigner. You think it is toy, a story, but it is not. If you cannot feed it properly, it will feed itself. From your blood. From your life." Adrian laughed, though the sound cracked with unease. "And what do you suggest I do?" Rizal's eyes narrowed. "Return it, or cast it away into the sea, but do not take it home. Do not let it follow you." The sharpness of his words unsettled Adrian more than he cared to admit. He wanted to argue, to tell Rizal he was overreacting. Yet even as he spoke, he noticed something chilling. The Jenglot's eyes seemed different now. Not the dull glassy stare of before, but moist, glistening, as if truly alive, watching, listening. That night, the scratching grew unbearable, louder, closer, until Adrian could no longer pretend it was his imagination. He bolted upright in bed, heart pounding, only to find the Jenglot sitting on his nightstand. He hadn't placed it there. The figure's long hair spread across the surface like roots, its claws stretched toward him, resting inches from his hand. Adrian scrambled back, his breath ragged, his pulse hammering in his ears. And though it didn't move again, he could feel its demand pulsing in the silence. Blood. It wasn't a suggestion anymore. It was a command. The storm broke just after midnight. Rain hammered against the tin roof of the guest house, wind rattling the shutters until they banged like restless fists. Adrian sat upright in bed, staring at the Jenglot where it rested on the nightstand. He hadn't dared put it back in its box. The scratching had become relentless when confined, as though the thing was trying to claw its way free. Out in the open, it was silent, but that silence was worse. It wasn't passive. It was waiting. The lamp flickered once, then went out. The room plunged into a dim half-dark, lit only by the sickly glow of lightning seeping through the curtains. Adrian's breath caught. The air felt thick, heavy with the smell of damp soil and something faintly metallic, like rust or blood. Then came the sound. Not scratching this time. Breathing, shallow, rasping, so close it raised the hair on his arms. He turned his head slowly, his heart jackhammering against his ribs. The Jenglot's glassy eyes reflected the lightning, and for the first time he swore he saw its tiny chest rise and fall. Adrian froze. The figure hadn't moved, at least not visibly, but the long strands of its hair had spread wider across the table, snaking downward until they brushed the floor. The storm outside roared, thunder shaking the walls, yet the room itself seemed to pulse with a rhythm that matched the pounding of his heart. Desperate, he grabbed the wooden box and tried to shove the Jenglot inside, but the lid wouldn't close. The figure's hair twisted and tangled around the edges, resisting. When he forced it harder, a sharp sting seared across his palm. He yelped, dropping the box, and saw a thin line of blood bead across his skin where one of the Jenglot's claws had cut him. The doll hadn't moved, but his blood dripped onto the desk. Instantly, the room shifted, the air grew colder, and the whispers began. Not outside, not in his imagination. Inside his skull, dozens of voices layered over one another, speaking in a language he couldn't understand, their tones both pleading and commanding. His vision blurred as the Jenglot's eyes seemed to shine, drawing in the droplets of blood as if the wood itself absorbed them. The strands of hair twitched, curling upward like grasping fingers. Adrian stumbled backward, clutching his hand, his breath shallow and panicked. "What do you want from me?" he gasped, though some part of him already knew the answer. A sharp knock exploded against the door. He spun toward it, half relieved, half terrified. The door creaked open, and Rizal stepped inside, his expression grim. He held a small clay bowl and a bundle of incense sticks clutched tightly in one hand. The storm's light caught his eyes, making them glint like steel. "You touched it," Rizal said flatly, his voice barely audible over the storm. "It has tasted you. Now you belong to it." Adrian shook his head violently. "No, I didn't. It cut me. Rizal raised the bowl, setting it carefully on the nightstand beside the Jenglot. Inside was raw chicken liver, slick and dark, glistening in the dim light. He struck a match and lit the incense, the smoke curling thick through the room, sharp and acrid. Adrian gagged at the smell, stumbling back further. "What are you doing?" Rizal didn't answer immediately. Instead, he placed the liver directly in front of the Jenglot, bowing his head slightly as if performing a ritual. Then he looked up, his eyes sharp. "You must feed it, or it will take from you until there is nothing left." Adrian's skin crawled. "You're saying this thing is alive?" "Not alive," Rizal corrected. "Not dead, a vessel, a trap for spirits. They hunger, they always hunger, and now you are bound." Adrian's world tilted, his mind refusing to reconcile the words with the reality before him. Yet, when the Jenglot's tiny jaw creaked open, the fangs glinting, he knew denial was no longer an option. The figure hadn't moved in days, but now its mouth quivered, stretching just enough to release a faint hiss that curled into the smoke-filled air. The liver began to wither, darkening as if the life was draining from it, its juices seeping toward the Jenglot without being touched. Adrian's stomach twisted. nausea rising in his throat. "This is insane," he muttered, his voice breaking. "I should burn it, smash it, throw it away." Rizal's eyes flashed with panic. "No, if you destroy it, the spirits are free. They will take you first, and anyone near you." Adrian felt the room close in, the storm pressing against the walls, the whispers growing sharper in his head until one voice, clearer than the others, cut through the noise. "Feed me." The words weren't spoken aloud. They were inside him, wrapping around his thoughts like chains. He clutched his bleeding hand, staring at the Jenglot, its claws curled tighter, its hair shifting across the table like living roots. For the first time, Adrian understood he wasn't a collector anymore. He wasn't a tourist with a strange souvenir. He was a keeper. And the thing he had taken wasn't just an object. It was alive in a way that defied every law of nature. And it wasn't going to let him go. The storm howled, thunder shaking the walls, as the Jenglot's glassy eyes fixed on him with unnatural hunger. Adrian backed against the wall, trembling, his world collapsing into a single question that clawed at his mind. How do you escape something that refuses to die? The storm eased just before dawn, the thunder rolling away into the horizon, but the silence it left behind was no comfort. Adrian sat slumped against the wall, his eyes fixed on the nightstand. The Jenglot still sat where Rizal had placed it, its claws curled delicately around nothing, its mouth frozen, half open. The liver in the clay bowl was shriveled now, dark and dry as if weeks had passed instead of hours. Rizal remained seated in the corner, the incense smoke thinning into faint ribbons that clung to the damp air. His expression was heavy, drawn tight with the kind of weariness that came from seeing this before. "You feel it, don't you?" he asked quietly. Adrian swallowed, his throat raw. "Feel what?" "The pull, the weight. That thing is bound to you now. It drinks from you, even when you sleep." Rizal's voice was calm, but the certainty in his words made Adrian's stomach turn. The memories rushed in like puzzle pieces clicking together. The deep, unnatural sleep since the night he bought it. The dreams filled with whispers. The way he woke drenched in sweat, with the taste of metal on his tongue. He thought it was exhaustion, stress, the heaviness of travel. But now, in the dim grey light of morning, he saw it for what it was. The Jenglot had been feeding on him all along. Adrian rubbed his face with trembling hands. "Why me? Why does it matter who has it?" Rizal leaned forward, his eyes hard. "It doesn't matter who. It only matters that someone carries it. Jenglot are vessels for spirits, spirits that cannot rest. They cling to the figure, trapped, but they hunger endlessly. Someone must feed them. And if the keeper refuses, if the blood is not offered willingly, the Jenglot finds another way." Adrian remembered the scratches on the box, the marks that hadn't been there before. The hair that grew overnight, the cut on his palm that seemed to happen so deliberately. He felt sick, realizing those hadn't been random events. They were the Jenglot's first attempts at feeding. Small trials, leading him toward the inevitable. His voice cracked as he asked, "And if I just get rid of it? Leave it here?" Rizal shook his head firmly. "It will not stay. Wherever you go, it follows. Some say it crawls back. Others say the spirits inside it tie themselves to your blood. You carry them now, whether you want to or not." The weight of the words pressed down on him, suffocating. He pictured himself back home, placing the figure on a shelf, pretending it was only a souvenir. The thought of those glassy eyes watching him, of hearing the scratching in the walls of his own apartment, filled him with dread. He thought of the whispers growing louder, feeding until nothing of him was left. Rizal must have read the terror on his face, because his voice softened. "There is one way. You can bring it to a holy man, a Kyai, a spiritual leader. Sometimes they know how to release the spirits, to send them back to where they belong, but..." His pause lingered, heavy. "It doesn't always work. And the keeper rarely survives unchanged." Adrian stared at the shriveled offering in the bowl, the lifeless meat that had somehow been drained without ever being touched. His chest tightened as he thought back to the hostess, how she had whispered her warning before rushing away. If no blood, it takes from you. He finally understood. Every reaction he had witnessed, the fear, the whispers, the refusal to touch it, they weren't superstition, they were experience. Locals knew. They had seen keepers before. Travelers who came chasing curiosities, carrying away nightmares instead. He looked at Rizal, his voice hollow. So, I can't get rid of it. I can't destroy it. I can only keep feeding it, or it takes from me. Rizal's silence was answer enough. The light of dawn crept slowly across the floor, touching the Jenglot where it sat in eerie stillness. For the briefest moment, Adrian thought he saw its tiny chest rise again, a subtle motion that chilled him to the core. The revelation was undeniable now. He hadn't purchased a curiosity. He hadn't found an oddity to tell stories about back home. He had inherited a role. The mask in Thailand had chosen its keeper through possession. The Jenglot did the same, binding itself not to a place but to a person. And Adrian realized with dawning horror that the figure on his nightstand wasn't just a relic of folklore. It was his responsibility now, and there was no escaping it. Adrian left the guest house before noon, the wooden box clutched tight under his arm. He didn't say goodbye to the hostess. He didn't thank Rizal. He simply walked out into the blinding sunlight, as though daylight alone might keep the whispers at bay. The streets were crowded, filled with vendors shouting over one another. But to Adrian, the city felt strangely hollow. Every voice seemed muffled. Every face seemed distant. Only the weight of the box felt real, pressing into his ribs like a reminder he couldn't put down. At the train station, he sat alone on a bench, the Jenglot hidden beneath layers of cloth inside the box. He tried not to look at it, tried not to think about the way its eyes had glistened in the morning light. But the whispers crept in anyway, curling around the edges of his thoughts, softer this time, coaxing rather than commanding. Feed me. The words slid into his mind so smoothly it was hard to tell where his own thoughts ended and theirs began. He clenched his jaw, tightening his grip on the beads still looped around his wrist. When the train finally arrived, Adrian boarded quickly, finding an empty seat by the window. The countryside blurred past, green fields stretching endlessly beneath a sky that promised rain. For a brief moment, he let himself imagine he had escaped, that the box beneath his seat was just wood and nothing more. Then he felt it, a faint tug against his wrist, subtle but undeniable, like a pulse not his own. He glanced down at the beads, and his stomach dropped. They were wet. Tiny drops of crimson beading against the wood, seeping from a cut on his palm that hadn't been there before. He turned slowly toward the box, dread crawling up his spine. The lid had shifted open, and though the train roared on, carrying him farther from Jakarta, Adrian knew the truth. He hadn't left the Jenglot behind. It was coming with him. It always would. I hope you enjoyed these stories. If you liked them and want to listen to more, feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best.